Okay, Steve, I thought I'd do a little video on the CAGED system. And, since it came up in the lesson last night, I'll discuss the CAGED system as a practical way, in a practical way, the theory versus practical side of it. So in order to best grasp the CAGED system, there's a couple things that you supposedly know already. So I'll just review these basics, right? The first thing is an understanding of all your basic chord shapes. So we'll look at A, right? We'll look at C. We'll look at D, the E shape, and the G shape. Now, the thing you may have noticed is that I skipped over the B chord and the F chord. Well, that's just because our B chord comes right out of the CAGED system. If I take my A and move the A chord up a whole step, so the second thing that's assumed that you know to understand the CAGED system is your musical alphabet, and that is the letters A through G. And two things about that. Number one is that it's not literally linear, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's really more like a circle. So we go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then when we get to G, we continue right back to A. So G abuts A, right? And that we can travel on that circle in any direction. We can go through the alphabet A to G and back to A, or we can go A and then G, F, and back reverse alphabet, right? So that's the first concept. The second one is understanding that everything is whole steps between those letters, except for B and C and E and F. Those are our only two half steps. So the distance between a B note and a C note is a half step. Distance between the E note and an F step is a half step. Now, the reason why I skipped over the B chord, if we went up the alphabet, we get A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we're back to A. Now I skipped over the B and the F for one simple reason, that these come directly from the CAGED system. So if I take my A chord, number one, I know it's rooted off the fifth string, open, and I know that the distance between the note A and the note B is a whole step. That means that it follows that if I have an A chord and I want to make it a B chord, I just move it up a whole step. So whole step from open A is to B. And then if this is my A triad, my A chord, I move it up a whole step. And that gives me my B chord, right? So we don't have a separate shape for the B chord. The B chord is really just an A chord moved up a whole step. Okay? The same is true for an E chord. When I play an E chord, I know that the distance between an E chord and an F chord is a half step. It's our other half step location. So if I take my E chord and I move it up a half step, I then have to remember that all my open strings also have to move a half step. So that means our F chord is really our E chord just moved up a half step, okay? And these are some of the principles that we follow in the CAGED system. So going back to the B chord, which we knew is an A chord just moved up a whole step, what happens if I move my B chord up a half step? Well, the distance between a B note and a C note is a half step. So if I move my B note up a half step and then move my chord or triad up a half step, I get a C chord. Okay? And of course, it sounds the same as what we think of as an open C chord or cowboy C chord, because it's really just using the same notes in a different place on the neck. Okay, so that's our basics of the CAGED system. Now, the CAGED system is really practical to use. Let's start with the C. Since the word CAGED starts with C, we're going to start with the C chord. Now, all we're going to do is we're going to build C chords, all C chords going up the neck, but we're going to use the shapes of the C chord, the A chord, the G chord, the E chord, and the D chord. And that spells CAGED, and that's how we get that system. So remember that now we're not changing chords, we're just keeping our C chord. We're going to start on the C, and the CAGED system is a circle just like our alphabet is. In other words, CAGED is a sequence. If we make a C chord using the C shape, the next one would be a C chord using the A shape, then a C chord using the G shape, and the C chord using an E shape, and then the C chord using a D shape. So they're in a sequence, and they're locked in that sequence. They're on the neck in that order. And you can play sequentially through all the C chords in those shapes. Okay? So, here's our C chord. Now, the next thing that's kind of important to know is understand where the roots are in your chords. And if you understand that this is a C chord, this is a C note, and this is the root of the C chord, then we're going to use that root to build our next shape on the CAGED system. So we're going to use the C to build the A shape. And there's my A chord, my A shape, which I've borrowed from here. You know, these are kind of arbitrary. You know, this is an A chord, but it's only an A chord in this shape in this position. Somewhere else it's a different shape, right? So anyway, it's going back to this. We got our C chord. CAGED says the next shape is an A. So I look at my root and I build my A shape. Okay. Now on the CAGED system, my next shape is a G shape. So I'm going to look where this is barred, creating my C triad, and I need to put a C in the root. And that's right here at the 8th fret. And when I see that shape, I can see that that's really just my G chord. Right? Creating my next C chord. So I have a C, then I have the A, and my next shape is the G. And you can see how they're connected. They're connected by this triad, right? And this root. And then we come to our next G shape. Our next shape, here's our C root, is the E shape. So I'm going to root the E shape off that note. And I get my C chord as an E shape at the 8th fret. Okay? So my next one is my D, and my final shape is my D shape. All right, let's leave this for a second, but we want to remember that here's my two C notes, which is my C and my octave from the D string here, right? So let's go down to our D shape here. When you play a D chord, you're playing the D string open. That's your root. So that means that if we want to move up the shapes, we have D, E, F, half step, G, A, B, and then half step to C. And there's our root off the C note at the 8th fret. So technically speaking, our G chord is this D chord, this triangle D chord right here, which is C right on my 12th fret. I'm sorry I don't have dots, but you do see that little figure on my neck. There's my 12th fret, and you can see there's my D chord, my D shape, which would be rooted right here, creating my final shape for my C chord. C, 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 and then of course C shape. And you see that if I move this down to my open strings, there's my D shape, open G, open E, and my C. Okay? So that gives me all 5 of my shapes of my C chords going up the neck. And that is it, really. Now, it's not practical to play the full chords in every location. For instance, that D is kind of awkward. If I was to play the full shape, that would be it. But we're really not going to use that. It's just not a practical way. But from a theory standpoint, that is my C chord. But practically speaking, knowing that D is pretty useful. Knowing this E shape is pretty useful, right? Knowing this G shape is pretty useful. On the G chord, it's not practical to play a big full G chord, but we can borrow the low side of it, or we can play the high side of it. That is practical. We can use that. Or we can do, for example, Neil Schon in Lights by Journey uses this G shape on a D chord to do that song Lights. Right. So he wrote a song, but he's only using the low side of that G shape on a D chord in his case. I just did it in C to stay in the same ballpark. Okay, so from that, we can learn a couple things. Number one is the sequence C, A, G, E, and D is locked together So no matter where we are on the neck, if we're playing a C shape, the next shape is the A shape. Okay, so as an example for that, if I'm playing a D chord, remember it's a circle, right? So if I'm playing a D chord, my next shape, CAGED, has to be a C shape. So if I think of my C shape, there's my C chord. Of course, now I've got open strings I have to deal with. So there is my D chord in my next sequence. C. Here's the root of the D chord. So that means my next shape is A style. So I have to play the A shape rooted on that D note. And then my next shape is going to be my G shape. And here I am rooted on the 10th fret, which would be my next E shape. And then of course, I'm back to the 14th fret for my D chord, which was where I started, down here. So that sequence is locked. So the next thing you want to do is look at all your open regular cowboy chords and figure out what the next shape would be. For example, just take an A chord. Where does that fall on the CAGED system? C-A-G-E-D. So our A shape, our next shape has to be the G shape. And we already can see that that's how we would build the next shape for an A chord. Here's the next shape for an A chord, which would be the E shape. And then of course here is my A chord in my D shape. And then here is my C shape, and that takes me back to where I started at A. And you can do that with all your chords. So take an E chord. Where does that fall in our CAGED? It's the second to the last. We know the next one is a D shape. Up 2 frets, up 4 frets, find your D chord. There's your E chord. Your D shape, I should say. The next one is C. There's my D shape. Down here, I've been now building the C shape in front of it. And then, of course, you'll notice that here's the 2 notes on the E chord that we start Cassidy with. That's just our E chord in the style that he plays it. Well, the next shape we're looking for after the C, remember this is an E chord with a C shape. The next one is the A shape. Of course, we have the luxury of being able to play that open E over that E chord. And then that leads to our next one, G. F chord. Well, our F chord is already just our E shape. So the next one would be a D. 2 whole steps. F, G, right? We're just looking at the distance because that tells you where that D shape should be for your F chord. That tells you where your C chord is, which is an F. And then the A shape, an F, and then the G shape. And you can see there we are at the 13th fret, which is where we started. Now you can use that to find your way around. The practical way to use the CAGED system is to be able to change to a chord, not only to be able to extend a chord. If I wanted to play an A chord, could use that to find my A chord. Right? So I could find my A chords going up the neck, or I could play a song just as if I had a capo on. When I play an A chord and I want to go to a D chord, I don't have to go here. I can go to the A shape of my D chord, right? And then I could go to an F chord or a C chord, F chord, C chord, B flat chord. In other words, I could stay in one place around the neck and make all my chord shapes. I'll say one final thing. That pretty much sums up how we identify the chord shapes on the neck. But I will say as a practical part of using the CAGED is you want to learn next to break up your chords into smaller fragments that are more useful. For example, one that's, if I take an A chord in the E shape and I extract the D string, G string, and B string, I get this shape. D string, G string, B string. When I play this chord, I'm playing those notes. Right? That's part of my E shape there. But that shape is really, really useful as a way to play fragments of these shapes, to not feel like you have to move all these giant shapes and all 5 fingers around the neck. You can create little riffs, where you go. So I'm borrowing this A chord, this D chord, this G chord, so I'm borrowing fragments of all these shapes to create movements and riffs on the guitar. And let's do a little final analysis. Cassidy, E chord to an A chord, right? Down a whole step from E is D. That's a D chord that we're just passing through really quickly to get to the A. In cowboy